Hey everybody, in chapter 18, what we're taking a look at here is a changing American society. And we're going to look at different groups of people that hadn't been represented fully in American society before the late 1960s and the 1970s. And we're going to start with the rise of the youth movement. And if you try to figure out like what that is and why that matters, what you have to go back to is the baby boom. You have to remember that large generation of people that were born after World War II were known as the baby boom. And you can see that right here, right? This period right after World War II ends, 1945, and then you can see it all the way up here to about 1964. And what that means is that if you take someone born, right, in 1946 and you add, I don't know, just 18 years onto it, right, then what you end up with is 1964. And so what we have is the 1960s really get underway is the very first baby boomers are turning 18, 19, 20 college age right as they are hitting the mid-1960s, and most of them, more than ever before, are going off to college. And you can see those numbers right here. This is a graph that shows you college numbers. And take a look, right? Here's 1959, still pretty low, not too low, but still low, it's going up. But we hit like that mid-1960s, and college enrollment goes through the roof. And I think that's what we want to make sure we understand, is that the baby boom fuels that increase of college enrollments in the early 1960s. And what that means is that these young people, for the first time, they're a generation of kids that have a sense of freedom and independence because they're off on their own in college. They have this need to now question authority. And you know, when you're at college, you know, they teach you to think critically, and you begin to question your political leaders and your parents, and we begin to see all these protests led by the young in America. Before you kind of think here that the young people of America don't have much power, what I want you to understand is that this is primarily a white American issue because it's mainly white Americans that are going to college. So that's the first thing. The second is that most of these kids who are part of the youth movement end up joining something called the New Left. And the organization that you are most familiar with inside the New Left is the Students for a Democratic Society, that group that we introduced way back in Chapter 17, Lesson 2. And remember that the focus of the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, was protesting on the Vietnam War. But there were a lot of other issues that members of the Students for a Democratic Society and the New Left were protesting, poverty, campus regulations, racism, nuclear power. There's a whole bunch of things that the young people in America, and again, mostly whites, because those are the ones attending college, that they were in fact protesting. The other thing I think that's really important to make a connection here to, again, back to chapter 17, lesson 2, is that we start to see people that are censored. They're getting restricted in their free speech, whether that's to hand out literature or recruit volunteers. And lots of people in the youth movement kind of push for a free speech movement in response to that. And it's really sparked by these restrictions on students' rights to distribute literature, to recruit volunteers for political causes on college campuses. And if you remember, we did that Tinker versus Des Moines, and Mrs. Davenport and I wore those armbands and the shirts. And really it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court does say that, yeah, kids, you do get a freedom of speech on campuses. You get to assemble on campuses in high schools. There are limits, of course. There are limits, like we talked about in Chapter 17, Lesson 2, but it is definitely a part of the culture of the youth movement, this idea of embracing a push for freedom of speech. And I think if you took all of this together, right, you take the youth movement sparked by all these white kids going off to colleges, you add into that the fact that they're a part of the New Left, and Students for Democratic Society are kind of the lead organization, and they're protesting against Vietnam, against racism and poverty. They're protesting for free speech. If you were going to try and take a look at all of these things, what you have are people that are working within the system. They want to reform the system that's already there. There are other people that just want to reject that system entirely. And they become what's known as part of the counterculture. And it's the idea that what people believe and how you behave, it goes against the mainstream. Let me show you what I mean. So here's a drawing of an arrow, right? Simple enough. And this is what most people do. This is the culture of the average person. You know, it's how we behave, how the average American behaves. And maybe you're okay with the overall culture, but you just don't like the direction that it's going in. You would rather it go in a different direction. So you begin to protest with the youth movement, or you join the New Left, or you join the free speech movement. You protest against Vietnam. And the goal of those things is to reform the system. So what you're trying to do is to work with the system and reform it so it'll change direction a little bit, more towards what you want. The counterculture says, forget that. We're going to live a lifestyle that goes completely against the culture. We're going to live our own way, and you can't make us live your way, because this is the counterculture. And I hope that makes a little more sense for you. You know, the tricky thing about this is that members of the counterculture they come from a very specific kind of background. Like, for example, all right, here's a picture of people in the counterculture. Hippies is what we generally call them, right? Just look careful at the picture. Something's missing. What don't you see in this picture? Oh, wait, there is one of them. Out of all of the 100 and something people that are here in this picture, yeah, there's one black dude. Just one. That counterculture that we get used to, that we think of as hippies, is mostly white youths from middle and upper class backgrounds. Those are the hippies that we know. They reject the conventions of established society. And really, this counterculture, these hippies, they held up a utopian idea that society should be freer and closer to nature and full of empathy and tolerance and cooperation and all these amazingly awesome things. And for a while, it seems like maybe they're onto something. But the thing is, after a few years, the counterculture kind of loses its momentum. Why? Why is it that most young people that embrace the counterculture are returning to mainstream American society? And the answer there is really simple. It's really, really simple. Dollar signs, money. And you want to go against culture? That's fine. But what happens when you need a tooth pulled, or you got to go to the doctor, or you need to eat, or you got to live somewhere and you can't be out, in the freezing cold all winter long? Well, you need money to do that. Well, man, where am I going to get my money, man? You got to get a job, kid, I mean, my father said there were two kinds of people in the 1960s. There were hippies and people that beat up hippies. And the idea here is that if you were a hippie, fine. But when you needed something from society, you had to come back to the culture. Look, the music of the time, fashion of the time, that still begins to impact American culture. Individualized dressing, beads, blue jeans, bell bottoms, long hair for men. Even just the long hair. That's from this rejection of conformity, right? That men can have long hair as well. And if you think that this stuff has gone away, it totally has not gone away, right? I mean, we all are familiar with what we call the hipster, right? Whether it's like the cruelty-free vegan of 2010 that has to have, the vegan's food and everything has to be just careful, or the I want to make everything myself crafter hipster, or maybe what you want is I'm a world traveler hipster, or the flower girl hipster, and oh my gosh, everything's so wonderful. Or maybe you want the lumberjack hipster. You remember these guys with the huge raggedy beards? Or maybe you have this coffee shop, I'm so educated and better than everyone else hipster, right? These folks, these ideas, they're still around, this kind of rejecting culture and doing my own thing. We put all this together, and I think we got a fairly good summary of the youth movement, and we'll talk more about this in class.